All right, so today we're diving deep into breath-holding spells in kids. We're going way beyond the "don't worry, they'll grow out of it" advice. You want to know why these episodes happen? And trust me, it's way more interesting than just waiting till kindergarten.
Yeah, what we often see is a link between a kid developing those emotional regulation skills, and when those breath-holding spells finally disappear, it's like they're learning to control those big reactions.
Okay, so let's back up. What even happens during a typical spell? You've probably seen it. A kid gets upset, they start crying, and then, bam, silence. They might turn blue or pale, get stiff, maybe even pass out for a sec. It's enough to make any parent panic.
Yeah, for sure. And these episodes usually follow a pattern, starting with something that sets them off.
Like what kind of thing?
Oh, it could be anything. A scraped knee, a toy taken away. That first frustration gets them crying, and then out of nowhere, they hold their breath.
Right? Like their body just hits pause. And that's when the color changes happen. They might turn blue. That's called a cyanotic spell, usually from anger or frustration. Or they go pale, a pallid spell, usually after pain or a fright.
And it's not just holding their breath. Their whole system kind of short circuits. They might go rigid, arch their back, even have some weird movements. I get why parents think it's a seizure.
Oh, totally.
Well,
Scary to see.
yeah.
But thankfully, there are differences between these spells and seizures, so parents can worry a little less.
Right. So first, almost every breath-holding spell has a trigger. You can usually trace it back to that tantrum or injury seizures. They'll often just happen.
So if you can pinpoint that first upset, it's probably a breath-holding spell.
Exactly. Another difference, breath-holding spells never happen during sleep. Never seizures can happen anytime, even during sleep. Also, breath-holding spells tend to look the same each time, while seizures can be unpredictable.
Okay, so predictable pattern, clear trigger, never during sleep. That means hopefully you can skip those stressful EEG tests.
Exactly. Most of the time, a doctor can diagnose this just by listening to the parent describe what happened. What they saw is way more useful than a test.
That's good to hear, because getting a toddler to sit still for an EEG, that's mission impossible. But knowing what doesn't cause these spells doesn't tell us what does. What's happening in their brains and bodies during these moments?
Well, the main theory is it's the autonomic nervous system, the one that controls stuff we don't think about, like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure. In young kids, this system is still developing, still learning to regulate everything.
So it's like their internal control panel is under construction and is kind of glitchy and prone to overreacting.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. When a little kid hits that trigger, the tantrum, the pain, the scare, their nervous system freaks out. This can cause a sudden drop in blood pressure and heart rate, less blood flow to the brain. And that leads to the scary stuff. Passing out, stiffening up, even those weird movements.
And this explains why these spells are so common in toddlers and preschoolers. Their nervous systems are literally being built, still figuring out how to handle big emotions. But there's also something about iron levels, right?
You got it. Research shows a strong link between low iron and these spells. Even kids without anemia can have low iron stores, and that makes them more likely to have these episodes. It seems like even a little iron deficiency messes with how their nervous system reacts to those emotional triggers.
But it's more than just being anemic. It sounds like even being a little low on iron can make these spells more likely. Why is that? Does iron affect the nervous system directly?
That's a good question. And researchers are still trying to figure all the details. But we do know iron is super important for brain development and for those neurotransmitters to work, right? Those chemical messengers in the brain. Plus, if a kid's blood isn't carrying enough oxygen because of low iron, those few seconds of breath holding, they can really make the oxygen shortage in the brain worse.
So low iron makes those nervous system freakouts even worse. It's like a double whammy for the little ones. So for parents seeing these scary spells, what's the first thing they should do? Where do they even begin?
Honestly, the most important thing is knowledge and reassurance. Just understanding that these episodes are usually harmless and they tend to go away over time, that can really help parents worry less. Knowledge is power in these situations, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But what can parents actually do to help their child through a spell? Is it just waiting it out?
Well, first things first, talk to your doctor about checking the child's iron levels, even if they're not anemic. A simple iron supplement can make a huge difference. And I know it's tempting to give in to a tantrum or give them lots of attention during a spell, but try not to do that. You don't want to accidentally teach them that holding their breath gets them more attention.
So no bribing with cookies to start breathing again.
Got it.
Are there other things parents can try? What about teaching kids ways to handle those big feelings?
That's a great point. It goes back to what we were talking about with emotional regulation. Helping kids learn to manage their frustration and anger can really help. It can make the spells happen less often and make them less intense, too.
Oh, like how?
Things like deep breathing exercises, counting to 10, even just naming their emotions can give them tools to deal with those big feelings before they turn into a breath-holding episode.
So instead of their systems going haywire, they're learning to take a minute, breathe, and maybe even use words instead of holding their breath. I love that. It's giving them the power to control it. But what about medication? Is that ever an option?
Most of the time, medication isn't needed. But in some really tough cases, like when the spells happen a lot or last a long time, or they're really upsetting for the child, that's when medication might be considered. There are meds that can help control heart rate or improve brain function. But those are last resorts, only after trying other things.
That makes sense. It's good to know meds aren't usually the first choice. But the good news is for most families, these spells don't last forever.
Absolutely. You're right. Breath-holding spells are almost always temporary. By the time a kid starts kindergarten, those episodes are usually a distant memory.
That's such a relief for parents. But why do they eventually disappear? Is it just the nervous system maturing?
Maturing definitely plays a big role, but it also happens at the same time as huge cognitive and emotional development. Kids are learning language fast, learning to express themselves better, and getting better at controlling their impulses and emotions. They're basically building stronger circuit breakers in their brains to handle those big emotions without those dramatic physical reactions.
So it's not just biology, it's the whole child developing. As their emotional regulation gets better, their bodies learn to react more calmly. Okay, I'm adding emotional regulation superhero to my parenting to-do list. But before we get too excited, let's recap what we've learned.
For sure. We've talked about how breath-holding spills are scary, but usually harmless, and they tend to go away on their own. They happen because a young nervous system overreacts to triggers, and low iron levels can make it worse.
And we've given our listeners some practical tips. Check iron levels. Don't reward breath holding. Teach those little ones how to regulate their emotions. And maybe learn some basic first aid for peace of mind.
Yep. We've also highlighted the incredible connection between a child learning to regulate their emotions and these spells going away. It's a fascinating look into how brain development, emotional maturity, and even those tiny iron molecules all work together. But before we finish up this deep dive, we need to talk about one more thing. While most kids go through this phase without any problems, it's important to remember that there can be rare complications with breath-holding spells.
You're right. It's reassuring to know most kids outgrow these spells, but there's always that little voice in the back of your head as a parent that wonders, but what if?
It's good to address those worries. In really rare cases, a breath-holding spell can turn into something serious called status epilepticus, which is basically a seizure that doesn't stop. It's an emergency that needs help right away.
Okay, so that's definitely something parents need to know about, even if it's super unlikely. What are the warning signs? When should a parent worry?
If a spell lasts way longer than usual, like more than a minute or two, that's a red flag. Also, if your child doesn't completely recover after, or if they seem confused, disoriented, or weak, get medical help right away.
Got it. Long spell. Any weird symptoms after it's overtime to call the doctor? Better safe than sorry. But let's focus on the positive, because even though these complications can happen, the overall outlook for kids with breath-holding spells is really good, right?
Absolutely. Most kids outgrow these spells, and there's no lasting effect on their intelligence, their development, or their long-term health. It's a temporary phase.
And that's what we want parents to take away from this deep dive. Yes, breath-holding spells can be scary and stressful, but if you have the right knowledge and a lot of patience, you can handle this phase with confidence. And remember, you're not alone. Many parents have been there, and their kids have done great. Wow. It's kind of wild to think that just helping our kids handle frustration could have such a big impact on their health and development. But it does make sense when you think about how connected everything is, especially when they're little.
Right, and it really shows how amazing those early years are. Their brains are developing and adapting like crazy. But all this talk about breath-holding spells going away as kids learn to regulate their emotions, it makes me wonder, we've talked a lot about those big feelings. What about how their thinking skills are developing? Could that play a role too?
That's interesting. Could there be a connection between these spells stopping and other thinking abilities getting better? We know language skills take off around the same time these spells tend to disappear. Maybe that's not a coincidence.
That's a great question. And something worth looking into more. Think about it. When kids learn to talk, they can tell you what they need and what's frustrating them. But they're also starting to understand cause and effect what happens because of something they do.
So instead of holding their breath to show they're upset, they're learning better ways to handle those tough moments.
Yeah,
It's like they're learning to talk their way out of those spells.
exactly. And it's not just language. Other thinking skills are developing too, like problem solving, planning, self-control, all around the same time. These skills are called executive functions, and they're super important for controlling behavior and impulses.
So it's like their whole brain is getting an upgrade. It's getting better at processing info, regulating emotions,
Yeah.
and controlling those knee-jerk reactions. And as those executive function skills get better, those breath-holding spells just fade away.
It's like a symphony. All these different parts of the brain are maturing and working together, and those breath-holding spells, maybe they're just a sign that the orchestra is warming up, getting ready for the big show.
I love that analogy. It's a way more comforting way to see those scary moments as a sign of progress, not something to freak out about. So for all the parents out there dealing with toddlers, remember those breath-holding spells? They'll probably go away. They might feel overwhelming now, but they're likely just a sign that your kid's brain is doing some amazing stuff behind the scenes.
You got it. And while those spells are going away, something incredible is happening. Your child is learning the skills to manage their emotions and deal with the world around them.
So to our listeners, if you're going through this right now, remember to breathe. You've got this. Learn as much as you can. Talk to other parents who get it. And trust that this won't last forever. Those breath-holding spells might feel like they'll never end, but they're really just a tiny blip in your child's development.
And while you're going through this, remember to celebrate the good stuff. Those times when your child takes a deep breath instead of holding it, when they use words to tell you they're frustrated, when they show you how strong and capable they are.
Well said. We've talked about a lot today, from what happens in the body during breath-holding spells to how emotional and cognitive development are connected. We hope you're leaving today feeling more informed, more empowered, and a little less scared of those dramatic moments.
And remember, this is just the start of your journey into the awesome world of child development. There's always more to learn, more to discover, and more to celebrate as your kid keeps growing and thriving.
So true. So keep asking questions, keep exploring, keep diving deeper into the things that matter most. And until next time, remember to take a deep breath, embrace the chaos, and enjoy the ride of being a parent.